Hercules looked up and down the beach, scouring the rocks. All he could see were shades of grey, jagged charcoal-coloured boulders, and pebbles of all shapes and sizes, all grey. The sky was overcast, darkening the surface of the Aegean Sea. Everything seemed to blend into each other, making it harder for Hercules to spot what he was looking for. And yet, he thought, the man should be easy to find. A human should stand out, clearly visible on the pebble beach. But the person Hercules was looking for was not just a man. His name was Nereus, though he was commonly known as the Old Man of the Sea. Nereus was a god, and perhaps the only one who could give Hercules the information he needed. Hercules had been told that Nereus often came to this particular beach for an afternoon nap. On warm days, he could be seen stretched out on the rocks. But finding him was one thing, and catching him was quite another. Hercules bent down and picked up a grey, sea-smoothed pebble. Sliding it between his fingers, he noticed its pleasant warmth. While the sky was overcast now, the sun had been shining brightly this morning. The pebble had absorbed its heat. It was a soothing sensation, the warm stone massaging his hand. Hercules found himself daydreaming for a moment. Then, as he walked slowly along the shore, still holding the pebble, he reflected that he may have missed his opportunity. Perhaps Nereus had been here earlier, when the sun was still shining. Now that it was hidden behind a veil of clouds, maybe the god had returned to the waves. Somewhere below the surface, he was doing whatever sea gods did, swimming with the dolphins, or commanding the fish, getting them to build him an underwater palace made out of seashells. Just as Hercules was getting swept up in his daydreams, he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. A movement at the far end of the beach, so subtle it might have been his imagination. Hercules walked onwards as quickly and quietly as he could. No easy task on a pebble beach. As he got closer, his heart quickened with excitement. There he was, Nereus, the Old Man of the Sea. Nereus lay on his back, fast asleep on the pebbles. With each deep breath, his chest rose, and his long white beard with it. It was braided at the ends, decorated with pearls and strands of seaweed. Hercules paused for a moment, pondering his next steps. He needed to talk to Nereus, who was said to know the location of the Garden of the Hesperides. This was where Hercules needed to go for his next task. He had no idea where the garden was or how to get there. Now, he was just a few feet away from the man with the information he needed. But from what he had heard, Nereus wouldn't be easy to catch. Hercules watched the gentle rise and fall of the old man's chest. While he was asleep, Hercules had the advantage. Still, he didn't want to startle him. Easy does it, thought Hercules, moving closer. He gently let go of the pebble in his hand, so he could grab hold of Nereus more easily. And although the clink of the pebble was a subtle sound, it was enough to wake up the old man. The next moments were a blur. Hercules quickly grabbed onto Nereus's shirt so he wouldn't escape. But almost as quickly, Nereus changed form, turning into a seal. He was a shape-shifting god. With the ability to transform rapidly, he was almost impossible to pin down. The old man became a seal, then a fish, then a sea serpent, and then Hercules lost track. All he knew was that he had to hold on as best as he could, whether he was grabbing onto a damp shirt or a slippery fin. Nereus was fast, but Hercules was strong, and he had faced greater challenges than this. He would stay here all day if he had to, wrestling with the god until the sun went down. But to his surprise, Nereus soon tired. He changed from a tuna to a beautiful sea nymph, and then finally back to his true form, an old man with a long white beard. "What do you want from me?" asked Nereus. He looked cross, but the pearls in his beard rattled against each other as he talked, and Hercules couldn't help but laugh. Keeping a firm hold on Nereus's shoulder, Hercules explained his mission. For his 11th labor, the king had asked him to travel to the Garden of the Hesperides and to steal 3 golden apples. But no one seemed to know exactly where the garden was located. Hercules hoped that Nereus, a god renowned for his knowledge as well as his truthfulness, had the answer. "It was true," said Nereus with a sigh. He knew nearly everything there was to know, and he was incapable of telling a lie. That was why he tried to keep to himself as much as possible. When he talked to others, he was often compelled to share things that should be kept secret, like how to find the Garden of the Hesperides. Hercules asked why the garden's location was such a secret. "Because of the golden apples," said Nereus. The apples were said to grant immortality to whoever took a bite. No mortal was meant to enter the garden, and especially not Hercules. "Why?" asked Hercules. "Because the garden belonged to Hera," said Nereus. "Ah," Hercules replied. "The goddess Hera hated him, so of course she would want to keep him out of her garden. Hercules would have to be careful and maybe trick his way in. But that was something to worry about later. For now, all he needed to know was where in the world the garden was located. The only thing he knew was that it was somewhere out west. Nereus nodded. Far, far west. He would tell Hercules how to get there, just as long as he didn't tell anyone else. And if Hera asked, Nereus had nothing to do with it. Hercules listened carefully as the old man whispered in his ear, memorizing the directions. "And now," said Nereus, "I must be going." Hercules wished that he could keep Nereus a little longer, asking him all kinds of questions. It wasn't every day one got to speak to an all-knowing sea god. Still, he was grateful for the information he'd received. Nereus had been very detailed. Hercules thanked the god, and then at last took his hand off his shoulders and moved back. Nereus was now free to leave. Right away, the old man turned into a seal and galumphing down the shore. Then, after waving a flipper in Hercules' direction, he launched himself into the water and disappeared. So many journeys, thought Hercules. He had travelled all over Greece, and he'd gone far east to the Black Sea and the land of the Amazons, and far west to the island of Erythea. This time, he would have to travel even further west, to what felt like the end of the world. As the journey would mostly be by sea, Hercules decided to leave his horse Ianthe in Greece. He would miss her, but he knew she would be better off on land. She'd had enough of long sea journeys, and so had he. As he travelled west, he made many stops along the way. In his dreams, the islands and coastal towns all blurred into each other. Palm trees, steep cliffs, sandy shores, and countless whitewashed houses. On his travels, he met men who spoke Greek and men who spoke languages like nothing he'd ever heard. He encountered giants, monsters, and a peculiar creature called a camel. And gradually, Hercules lost track of days and nights. He was always on the move, sleeping somewhere different each evening. Some nights he fell asleep in a fisherman's cottage. Others he drifted off on the deck of a ship. But always to the sound of the waves. And it was a sound so familiar, so comforting, that he would fall asleep almost instantly. At last, after many weeks, Hercules caught his first glimpse of the garden of the Hesperides. It was sunset, which felt fitting. After all, the Hesperides were the nymphs of the evening. These women, the guardians of the orchard, were associated with the golden light of sunset. Hercules had finally arrived in the far west, the land of the setting sun. From his ship, Hercules gazed up at the garden. Just as Nereus had told him, it was positioned high up on a promontory, jutting out into the sea. Although he was still too far away to be sure, Hercules thought he could see glints of gold among the leaves of the trees. Perhaps these were the famous golden apples, the fruit that granted immortality. But before Hercules could see for himself, he would have to get past the guards, the nymphs who lived in the garden. The goddess Hera had instructed them to look after her precious trees. And according to some rumors, there might be a dragon too, an extra level of security. Perhaps Hera didn't entirely trust the nymphs. As Hercules walked up the hill towards the garden, he hoped that he would somehow get lucky. Maybe there would be no dragon, and he would find the nymphs asleep in the grass. He could simply walk past them, take 3 of the apples, and then head home. Of course, it was never quite that simple, but wouldn't it be nice? When Hercules reached the top of the hill, he paused for a moment to admire the view. The sky was a haze of pink and red, with wisps of golden cloud, and the ocean was a dazzling mirror. The ship that had brought him here was anchored in the bay, bobbing up and down on the gentle waves. From up here, it looked so small, a tiny silhouette on gold-tinged water. Hercules reflected that he'd been walking for a while. It had been quite a climb up the hill. How was it possible, he wondered? The sun had been setting when the ship sailed in, and it was still setting now, hovering at the same point on the horizon. There should be at least a hint of darkness in the sky, but time seemed to be suspended. Once, Hercules would have told himself that it was only his imagination. But now, after all his adventures, he could believe anything. Maybe time really was standing still. Maybe the Garden of the Hesperides existed in another dimension. The world was full of beautiful mysteries. Once he had caught his breath and gathered his thoughts, Hercules turned towards the garden. There was a fence around it, but it wasn't particularly high. And there was a gate, but no sign of a guard. No nymphs, let alone a dragon. To his surprise, Hercules was able to simply lift the latch and stroll right in. He found himself in a dense thicket of trees. The leaves had the most wonderful fragrance, both earthy and floral. It was the scent of pure nature. Hercules closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply. Then, as he walked on across the grass, he realized that this truly was an orchard rather than an ordinary garden. There were no paths, only lush grass and endless trees. Some had fruits he recognized: figs, pomegranates, and persimmons. Unable to resist, Hercules plucked a fig from the branch and bit into it. It was utterly delicious, sticky, sweet, and rich, like honey in the form of a fruit. After gathering a few more figs for later, Hercules walked on, deeper into the garden. The soft orange light of sunset filtered through the trees, so that every leaf, every blade of grass seemed to glow. The garden of perpetual sunset, thought Hercules. How beautiful it was, like something from a dream. Winding his way through the grove, Hercules soon reached a clearing, and there he saw what he was looking for: the golden apples. They hung from the branches, shining and pendulous. Some glinted in the sunlight. They almost seemed to be winking at him, enticing him. Hercules was so mesmerized by the sight of the apples that it took him a moment to realize, to see what else was in the clearing. Lying in the grass just below the trees were 3 young women fast asleep. They all had dark skin and long black hair and looked like sisters. These had to be the nymphs, the Hesperides themselves. One of the sleeping women, Hercules noticed, clutched a half-eaten golden apple in her hand. He doubted that the nymphs were allowed to eat the fruit that they had been ordered to protect. Perhaps he could use this transgression to his advantage and bargain with them. Hercules took slow, careful steps across the grass. There was always a chance that he could take the apples without waking them. But as he came closer, one of the nymphs stirred, and a moment later, they were all awake. The 3 women sat up, staring at Hercules. Their expressions weren't hostile. More than anything, they looked confused, as though they were still half asleep. But gradually, they came to their senses, and the nymph who held the apple quickly tucked it behind her back. Smiling, Hercules asked if Hera knew that the nymphs were eating her golden apples. The 3 women blushed. "Please," they said, "don't tell Hera." Hercules promised that he wouldn't, but on one condition. They had to let him take 3 apples for himself. The nymphs huddled together and whispered among themselves. Then, turning to Hercules, they shook their heads in unison. It wasn't worth the risk, they said. If Hera found out that the nymphs were eating the apples, she'd be angry. But if she found out that Hercules had stolen her apples, well, there was no telling what she'd do. "You're on her list," said one of the nymphs. Hercules sighed. He knew he was on Hera's list, among her other enemies. Now what? He wondered. Hercules looked longingly at the apple trees, then down at the nymphs. The women looked so similar, almost identical. They had to be sisters. He remembered that some called them the daughters of the evening. Daughters, Hercules repeated to himself. Who were their parents? A distant memory was coming back to him, slowly floating up to the surface of his consciousness. Tell me, said Hercules, who's your father? The nymphs exchanged looks, unsure if this was supposed to be a secret from Hera. They couldn't remember all the goddess's rules. There were so many. Atlas, said one of the nymphs at last. Our father is Atlas. Hercules asked where he could find Atlas. Again, the nymphs looked at each other, and they decided that they'd already given enough away. Hercules would have to find Atlas himself. But he's nearby, isn't he? Asked Hercules. Instinctively, one of the nymphs nodded. Then, noticing the disapproving looks from her sisters, she quickly shook her head. Hercules thanked the nymphs, then turned to leave. It was time he was on his way. At least he thought so. It was hard to tell exactly how much time had passed, as it was still sunset. Here, it would always be sunset. Once the garden was out of sight, nightfall arrived quickly. Hercules walked inland and spent the night in a sleepy village, which consisted of just a few ramshackle houses and a dusty square. But his host was kind, and his bed comfortable, though Hercules would have slept well regardless. He was so tired. The next morning, he set off on foot towards the mountains. It was here that he hoped to find Atlas, the father of the nymphs. Atlas was a Titan, one of the old gods. He had been around for longer than Zeus, longer than Hera, and he was said to live right at the top of the mountain. There he stood, day and night, using his incredible strength to hold up the heavens. Hercules' plan was to negotiate with Atlas. The nymphs wouldn't give the golden apples to Hercules, but if their father asked for some fruit, perhaps there was a chance. After climbing all day, Hercules reached the top of the mountain. Night had fallen, and the sky was spectacular. An endless expanse of indigo with infinite shining stars. Holding it all in place was Atlas. He stood on the rocky peak of the mountain, with his arms raised supporting the weight of the sky. When Hercules arrived, Atlas lowered his gaze from the heavens. He seemed surprised to see Hercules, to have any visitor at all, in fact. "You look tired," said Hercules. "It must be exhausting standing there with the weight of the world on his shoulders." Atlas shrugged. Yes, he was tired, but after all this time, he was used to it. All the same, he admitted, it would be nice to have a break. Hercules made his proposal. He would take over from Atlas for a little while, if the god did him a favor. Atlas agreed willingly. Yes, he said, he would go to the garden of the Hesperides and ask his daughters for 3 golden apples. However, Atlas looked Hercules up and down. As a god, Atlas was tall and brawny. He wasn't quite a giant, but almost. Hercules, on the other hand, was he strong enough to hold the sky? Hercules began to reel off his accomplishments, defeating the lion of Nemea, wrestling the Cretan bull, and most recently, pinning down the old man of the sea. There was no doubting his strength. "Very well," said Atlas. He was still a little hesitant, but the prospect of a break was irresistible. And so, the man and the god exchanged places. Atlas told Hercules exactly how to stand so that the weight was spread evenly. The sky was heavy, Hercules discovered, but not as heavy as he'd expected. And it was a different kind of weight, somehow less burdensome than an object. If he'd had to describe it, he would have likened it to holding a dense, precious cloud. Incredible, thought Hercules. So this was what it was like to hold the sky in your hands. Once Atlas was reassured that Hercules could bear the weight, he set off down the mountain. He would be back soon, he promised. It was a night Hercules would never forget. Tired, yet wide awake. Humbled, yet filled with an extraordinary sense of power and responsibility. All night long, he gazed upwards, filled with a new appreciation for the beauty of the world. As he traced the constellations, he drifted into a waking dream. Atlas returned at sunrise, the 3 golden apples glinting in his hands. He was impressed to see Hercules still standing there, showing no signs of tiredness. Now, Atlas had a favor to ask. He wanted to extend his break, to have a little holiday. Perhaps he could deliver the apples to the king on Hercules' behalf, while Hercules stayed in position on the mountain top. Then Atlas would return, of course, and they could swap back. Hercules didn't answer at once. He needed a moment to think. On the one hand, it was tempting. He was tired of traveling, and it might make a pleasant change, staying here on the mountain. But could he trust Atlas to return? If the god decided not to keep his word, Hercules would be left stranded on the mountain. Someone needed to hold up the heavens, and it wouldn't be easy to find a substitute. No, Hercules decided, it wasn't worth the risk. But he couldn't decline outright. He was so close to getting the apples, and he couldn't lose them now. Hercules suggested that he and Atlas swap places for just a moment. He wanted to adjust his cloak, and he needed a free hand. Slowly and carefully, Hercules and Atlas made the exchange. Atlas now stood in his usual position, holding up the sky while Hercules held the apples. There was a strange silence as the man and the god looked at one another. "Oh dear," said Atlas. He realized that he'd fallen for Hercules' trick. Hercules apologized and said that unfortunately he had no choice. He didn't want to end up stuck with the sky, especially as he still had so much to do. Once he'd brought the apples to the king, he still had another labor to complete. Atlas sighed. He'd been looking forward to a holiday. Just then, Hercules had a flash of inspiration. If he himself, a man who was mostly mortal, was capable of holding up the sky, then there would be others. Perhaps Atlas could organize a kind of contest, inviting other men to have a go. That way, aspiring heroes could demonstrate their strength, and Atlas could have a break every now and then. Somewhat appeased, Atlas nodded. It wasn't a bad idea. By now, the sun was high in the sky. It illuminated the clouds and made the mountains gleam silver. Shielding his eyes, Hercules looked slowly from left to right, admiring the panorama. He could see the garden of the Hesperides in the distance and the shimmering sea. It truly felt like he was on top of the world. Atlas's job was a tiring one, but the views were something else. The man and the god parted on good terms, with Hercules promising to send any strong men he encountered in Atlas's direction. And then, in the crisp light of the morning sun, Hercules made his way down the mountain. With the golden apples in his pocket, he felt ecstatic. At long last, he had what he needed. He was so close to completing his quest. But it wasn't quite over yet. Later that day, when Hercules stopped to bathe in a mountain stream, he received an unexpected visitor. He'd just been cooling off underwater, and as he resurfaced in the river and shook the droplets from his hair and beard, he spotted a familiar figure. It was the goddess Athena. She stood by the river's edge, tall and imposing, but with a slight smile on her face. In her hands, she held the 3 golden apples. "You can't keep these, you know," said Athena. Hercules stared at her, crestfallen. That was the last thing he wanted to hear. Athena reminded him that the apples, like everything else in the garden of the Hesperides, belonged to the goddess Hera. It was bad enough that Hercules had helped himself to some figs, but the apples, Hera would never forgive the theft of the apples. However, said Athena, she had a solution. Hercules could bring the apples back to Greece and show them to the king. Once the king had seen the apples and agreed that Hercules had completed his labor, the fruit could be returned to the garden. To save Hercules another long journey there and back, Athena would take the apples herself. Hercules breathed a sigh of relief. He was so grateful to have at least one goddess on his side. Athena turned the apples over in her hands. In the radiance of her divine glow, the apples seemed almost dull in comparison. "Don't be tempted," Athena added. Hercules mustn't eat the apples, even though they were, of course, delicious and would make him immortal. There was no rush. Hercules would become immortal in time anyway, if he stayed on the right path. Speechless, Hercules gaped at Athena. But before he could ask any questions, Athena put the apples down in the grass and explained that she had to go. Hercules wasn't the only hero she had to keep an eye on. But the two of them would meet again in Greece when it was time to hand over the apples. After these words, Athena vanished, dissolving in the air, and the birds resumed their singing. That evening, Hercules found a garden. It wasn't as beautiful as the garden of the Hesperides, but it had other things in its favour. Namely, it was not guarded by nymphs, and it didn't belong to Hera. It was a small, humble garden attached to one of the ramshackle houses in the village where Hercules had stayed before. After asking for permission from the bemused house owner, Hercules settled down to sleep in the grass. His recent experience on the mountain top had given him a craving for fresh night air and an unobstructed view of the stars. It felt so good to lie down. His feet were tired from his trek up and down the mountain, and his arms ached from holding up the heavens. No wonder, thought Hercules. He had so much admiration for Atlas, so much gratitude for Athena, and a renewed appreciation for everything in this world, which was bigger and more awe-inspiring than he had ever imagined. As he lay there, Hercules breathed in deeply. He could smell the scent of the grass and the sweetness of the oleander that bloomed all around the garden. Above him, there were so many stars, infinite pinpricks of light, gleaming like apples, like a celestial orchard. In Hercules' mind, images and memories merged, and it became harder and harder to follow his thoughts. Soon, quite effortlessly, he fell into the deepest sleep.